We all have this romanticized idea of the Victorian era. Thanks to movies and literature, we picture gentlemen in top hats, ladies in poofy dresses, and cobblestone streets that look charmingly misty. We imagine a polite society where everyone drank tea and spoke in perfect grammar. But let me shatter that illusion for you right now. The reality of living in a major city like London or New York in the 1800s was closer to a post-apocalyptic survival horror game than a period drama. If you had a time machine, this is the one place you would definitely want to skip. Let's get into it. Number 8. The housing situation. If you think your current rent is high for a shoebox apartment, you have seen nothing yet. That is like complaining about a slow Wi-Fi connection to someone who communicates via smoke signals. In the Victorian era, urbanization happened way too fast. People flooded into cities for factory jobs, but developers didn't bother building enough houses. The result was the slum tenement, or in London, the rookeries. These weren't just crowded. They were human sardine cans. Imagine a single room about the size of a modern parking space. Now pack 3 entire families into it. We are talking about 20 to 30 people sharing one room. There was no privacy. There was barely enough oxygen. It gets worse. If you were truly broke, you couldn't even afford a spot on the floor. You had to go to a penny flop house. For a penny, you could sit on a bench all night. You weren't allowed to lie down. If you had 2 pennies, you could upgrade to the 2-penny hangover. This was a long rope strung across the room. You draped your body over the rope like a wet towel and slept hanging there. In the morning, the landlord would just cut the rope, and everyone would wake up by hitting the floor. There were no building codes. Ventilation was non-existent. Most of these rooms had no windows. The walls were often damp and leaking. Because so many people were crammed together, body heat and breath created a permanent sticky humidity. If one person got sick, everyone got sick. It was a petri dish the size of a city block. Landlords didn't care because there was always someone else waiting to take the spot. You might hate your homeowners association today, but at least they don't make you sleep on a rope. Number 7. The fatal fashion trends. People back then were literally dying to look good. That is like wearing a suit made out of radioactive waste just because it glows in the dark. Victorian fashion was obsessed with a very specific shade of green. It was vibrant. It was eye-catching. And it was everywhere. They used it for dresses, gloves, shoes, and even artificial flowers in hair. The problem was the recipe for this dye. It was called Scheele's green, and its main ingredient was arsenic. Arsenic is a heavy metal poison. When a woman wore an arsenic green dress, the heat and sweat from her body would release the poison. It would absorb directly into her skin. She would suffer from headaches, sores, and vomiting, all while looking incredibly stylish. It wasn't just the wearer who suffered. The seamstresses who sewed these dresses inhaled arsenic dust all day. They would cough up green phlegm and eventually die of poisoning. It wasn't just the green dresses either. Men wore top hats that were treated with mercury to turn the fur into felt. This is where we get the term Mad Hatter. The mercury fumes caused neurological damage, leading to tremors, paranoia, and confused speech. Then you had the makeup. To achieve that pale, ghost-like look that was so trendy, women used face powders based on lead. Lead accumulates in the body and attacks the nervous system. Over time, it caused their wrist muscles to paralyze, meaning they couldn't even lift their hands to apply the makeup that was killing them. Fashion has always been painful, but in the Victorian era, it was a biological weapon. Number 6. The medical cures. Going to the pharmacy in the 1800s was more dangerous than walking through a minefield. That is like trying to fix a headache by hitting yourself with a hammer. There was no FDA. There were no regulations. Anyone could bottle anything and sell it as a miracle cure. And usually, the cure was just hard drugs. If you had a cough, a toothache, or just felt a bit sad, the doctor would prescribe laudanum. Laudanum is just opium dissolved in alcohol. It's highly addictive. You had respectable grandmothers who were stoned out of their minds 24/7 because their tonic kept them calm. It gets darker when you look at children's medicine. There was a famous product called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was marketed to tired mothers who had crying babies. The bottle promised to soothe any child instantly, and it worked. Do you know why? Because it was loaded with morphine. Mothers were unknowingly drugging their infants with heavy narcotics. Many babies never woke up. They called it the quietness, which is the most terrifying euphemism for an overdose I have ever heard. Later in the era, Bayer introduced a new, non-addictive substitute for morphine. They marketed it as a cough suppressant for children. They called it heroin. Yes, that heroin. You could buy it over the counter. If you had syphilis, they gave you mercury. The side effects of mercury include your teeth falling out and your sanity crumbling. The medical philosophy seemed to be that if the patient is unconscious or hallucinating, they aren't complaining about the pain anymore. Number 5. The food supply. You think processed food today is bad, but Victorian food was barely food at all. That is like eating a cardboard cutout of a burger that has been spray-painted brown. Adulteration was the name of the game. Shopkeepers wanted to maximize profit, so they cut their products with cheap, dangerous fillers. Let's talk about bread. To make the flour look whiter and weigh more, bakers added alum chalk and even crushed animal bones. If you ate a sandwich, you were basically eating a stick of sidewalk chalk. Milk was even worse. It was often watered down and then mixed with chalk or plaster to make it look white again. But since it was watered down, it wouldn't form a layer of cream on top. To fake the cream, they added mashed up calf brains. I am not joking. You were drinking water, chalk, and brains. There was also a scandal involving swill milk. In big cities like New York, cows were kept in dark, filthy basements attached to whiskey distilleries. They were fed the boiling hot, leftover mash from the alcohol production. The cows were sick, their tails fell off, and their milk was bluish and full of bacteria. This milk killed thousands of children, but it was cheap, so people bought it. Meat was often rotten. To hide the smell and the green color, butchers would wash old meat with chemicals like boric acid to make it look fresh and red again. Even your candy wasn't safe. Brightly colored candies were painted with lead and copper. Eating dinner was a game of Russian roulette. You had to inspect every bite to make sure it wasn't going to send you to the grave. Number 4. The workplace hazards. Workplace safety laws were non-existent, and human life was cheaper than the machinery. That is like working in a fireworks factory where the break room is also the testing range. The Industrial Revolution ran on coal and steam, but it was fueled by human misery. Let's look at the matchstick girls. These were young women who worked in factories making phosphorus matches. The fumes from the white phosphorus would eat away at their jawbones. It caused a condition called phossy jaw. The bone would rot, smell terrible, and eventually glow in the dark before the jaw had to be removed entirely. Then you have the chimney sweeps. These were usually small boys, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, because they were the only ones who could fit inside the narrow flues. They would climb up inside the chimneys to scrape out the soot. Many got stuck and suffocated. The ones who survived often developed a specific type of cancer from the constant exposure to soot. In the textile mills, the machines didn't have safety guards. If your sleeve got caught in a gear, it would pull your arm in, and the machine wouldn't stop. You would be fired for bleeding on the cotton. There was no workers' compensation. If you were injured, you starved. Hours were long, often 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was no overtime pay. You stood on your feet until you collapsed. If you fell asleep, you were beaten. It makes your current 9-to-5 job and boring meetings look like a vacation in the Bahamas. Number 3. The Sanitation Crisis. Cities were growing faster than their sewer systems, turning the streets into open toilets. That is like living in a portable toilet that hasn't been emptied in a decade. In London, for example, most houses had cesspools in the basement. These were just pits where waste went. When they were full, you had to pay a night soil man to shovel it out. But landlords didn't want to pay, so the cesspools just overflowed. The waste would seep into the floorboards and leak into the water wells. You were drinking your neighbor's toilet water. This all peaked in the summer of 1858 with the Great Stink. The River Thames was used as the main sewer for all of London. In the hot summer sun, the river began to ferment. The smell was so bad that it shut down the government. Parliament is located right on the riverbank. The politicians tried soaking their curtains in chloride of lime to block the smell, but it didn't work. They literally couldn't legislate because the smell of poop was too powerful. This filth led to massive cholera outbreaks. For a long time, people thought disease was caused by miasma, or bad air. It took a doctor named John Snow to prove that cholera was in the water. He famously removed the handle from a public water pump and the local outbreak stopped. Before that, people were drinking water that was visibly brown and wondering why they kept dying. Hygiene wasn't just poor, it was lethal. Number 2. The surgery. If you needed an operation, you were better off taking your chances with the injury. That is like letting a blindfolded lumberjack perform a delicate repair on your laptop. Anesthesia wasn't widely used until later in the era, and even then, it was risky. For a long time, speed was the only thing that mattered. Surgeons were judged by how fast they could amputate a leg. The most famous surgeon, Robert Liston, could remove a leg in under 30 seconds. That sounds impressive until you hear about his accidents. In one surgery, he moved so fast he accidentally cut off his assistant's fingers. He also slashed the coat of a spectator. The patient died of gangrene, the assistant died of gangrene, and the spectator died of shock. It was the only surgery in history with a 300% mortality rate. There was no concept of germs. Surgeons didn't wash their hands. In fact, a bloody apron was seen as a badge of honor. It showed you were a busy, successful doctor. They would go from dissecting a corpse in the morgue straight to delivering a baby without even wiping their hands. Tools were just wiped on a rag between patients. Hospitals were known as houses of death. If you could afford it, you had surgery on your kitchen table because it was cleaner than the hospital operating room. The pain of surgery without anesthesia was so bad that strong men had to hold the patient down. People would rather die of the infection than face the knife. And honestly, I don't blame them. Number 1. The air quality. The very air you breathed was trying to kill you every single second of the day. That is like locking yourself in a garage with a running diesel truck and calling it fresh air. We talk about smog today, but Victorian smog was a different beast. They called them pea soupers because the fog was thick, yellow, and greasy. It wasn't just water vapor. It was a mix of coal smoke from millions of chimneys and chemical fumes from factories. This fog was so thick you physically could not see your own hand if you held it out in front of your face. People would walk off the edges of docks and drown in the river because they couldn't see where the street ended. Traffic would stop completely. Crime skyrocketed because you could rob someone and vanish into the gray wall 2 feet away. But the real horror was what it did to your body. The sulfur dioxide turned into sulfuric acid in your lungs. You were breathing acid. During the worst fog events, the death rate would spike. People with asthma or bronchitis didn't stand a chance. At the Smithfield Cattle Show, prize-winning cows started choking and dying right in their stalls. They had to be slaughtered on the spot to save the meat. Inside your house, everything was covered in a layer of black soot. You would clean a surface, and an hour later, it would be black again. Your clothes, your skin, your snot, everything was black. You lived in a chimney. The sun could be blocked out for days at a time. It was dark, cold, and toxic. It was the ultimate atmosphere of dread. So, the next time you feel annoyed by a delayed subway train or a long line at the grocery store, just remember the Victorians. You have antibiotics, you have indoor plumbing, and your bread doesn't contain crushed bones. You are living the dream. Check your own pockets right now. If you don't find a bottle of morphine syrup or a handful of coal dust, you are doing just fine. Thanks for hanging out. If you enjoyed this dive into the nightmare of history, hit that like button. I'll catch you in the next one. Stay chill.